Hello, hello, and welcome everyone. Thank you so much for keeping your microphones muted during the event. It will ensure a better experience for all of us. I am Sayonara Hayes. I'm from the Danish Institute for Human Rights, and I will be facilitating this event with an incredible lineup of speakers who will be joining us during this next 1 hour and a half. Maybe it would be a better connection for everyone if we keep our cameras off, even though I really like seeing more faces here. But that would probably ensure that we have a better connection for everyone if we keep the cameras off, unless you are speaking. In that case, I will ask you to please turn on your camera and your microphone. But apart from that, let's please keep cameras and microphones turned off. We are recording this event, as you might have received a little message on top of your screen now, and we plan to share the recording and some of the resources after the event. We welcome you to please use the chat. You can use it for introducing yourselves, get some action going on there, but also to send some comments and questions. And during the discussions, we will try to monitor that at the end of the event and see if we have the opportunity of bringing some of your inputs as well into the session today. For those who would prefer to listen to this event in Spanish, we do have access to interpretation. There is on the chat, you can find the instructions that was posted by my colleague Sophie. So please follow that and you can follow us in Spanish as well. And to our speakers, I have to say, we do have a long list today, as you have noticed, for very short time to accommodate everyone. So we will ask you to please keep to the time. And I apologize in advance if I have to cut anyone short. It's not for lack of interest, it's just for interest of time. So this is a little bit of our housekeeping. And now we are ready to start our event. And I would like to start by mentioning that this event has been organized by the Danish Institute for Human Rights and partners. And here present you have the Ministry of Foreign Affairs, both of Norway and Denmark, the Office of the High Commissioner for Human Rights. I will be referring to it as OHCHR from now on. Also the Global Alliance of National Human Rights Institutions and the regional networks of national human rights institutions, both from Asia Pacific and from Europe. And also, we have, these have been our co-organizers, and I also would like to thank and welcome our speakers, among which those that I have not mentioned on the list right now also include the Special Rapporteur on the situation of human rights defenders, the NHRIs, the National Human Rights Institutions of Georgia, the Philippines, and Kenya, and also Forus International, to whom I give a really warm welcome, and I thank you all for taking the time for being here. The same goes to each one of you attending this event right now from wherever you are. We are really pleased, I have to say, to have this event which brings together many of the partners that have been working together with the Danish Institute for Human Rights in this journey to develop the monitoring framework and tool to support the monitoring and reporting on the enabling environment for human rights defenders, which we are here and very excited to launch today. We are launching this also during a very important year for what is commonly known as the UN Declaration on Human Rights Defenders, as we are celebrating this year its 25th anniversary. So it's all very timely. However, while it is really exciting to launch this tool, the reasons for why we even have to do this work is much grimmer. Over the last 25 years, the space for defenders to defend rights and to exercise fundamental freedoms has deteriorated in many parts of the globe, whether you are in the South, in the North, in the East, or in the West. Defending rights in some countries is a crime. In others, it's a deadly activity. And in 2021 alone, the United Nations has reported 320 fatal attacks against human rights defenders, journalists, trade unions across 35 countries. The reports and the studies are also documenting the use of restrictive legislation, threats, misuse of legislation, stigmatization, harassment, and so many other brutal practices to curtail and silence the legitimate activities of human rights defenders. So here we are, launching what we really believe to be a uniquely comprehensive framework to both monitor the Declaration on Human Rights Defenders at national levels. And I will ask the colleagues, please, to mute yourself if you are unmuted. We have some background noise right now. Thank you so much. We are launching here what we really believe it's a unique framework to monitor the UN Declaration at national level, but also to stimulate collaboration between actors such as national human rights institutions and civil society and other actors to try to address in a collective way these very disturbing trends that I mentioned just now. And we are proud to say that this work has been developed by the Danish Institute in collaboration with more than 20 partners, including UN agencies, national human rights institutions and its networks, human rights defender groups, and other civil society networks as well. And we thank everyone who has been involved for the work and contributions and inputs throughout this past 2 years or so of work to get to where we are today. And before we listen to the first speakers, and before I extend myself so much, I would like to invite my colleague Sophie Hansen to get a little bit of a sense of who are the participants in the room with a little poll. So welcome, Sophie. Sophie, you're muted.
So we are asking to get an overview of which organizations you are joining us from. Are you a national human rights institution? Are you from civil society? I have just started a poll, and you are invited to let us know. And it should hope if the technical gods are with us, you will be able to see the poll, and I will also be able to show the results. Very good. We have a lot of responses already now. Are you seeing the result? Okay, so I hope you can see the results. We have around 40% joining from civil society and 30% joining from NHRIs. We do have some participation from academia, 7-8%, it's increasing, from private sector, and also a few representatives of UN organizations. So we see a strong participation. We also see a few people joining from ministries or departments. So we are mostly civil society NHRIs, but also we do have representation from different actors, which is really great for this tool. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Sophie, for that, and a big welcome again to all of you joining us today. And we are now ready to start our conversation, and we will start by hearing some opening remarks from the Ministry of Foreign Affairs in Norway and the Office of the High Commissioner for Human Rights. So to the participants, the two participants, please, we invite you to join the conversation in the chat as well for everyone else. I would like now to give the virtual floor to some opening remarks from Mrs. Hebog Olsoka, the Director of the Human Rights, Democracy and Gender Equality section of the Ministry of Foreign Affairs, Norway. Mrs. Olsoka, you have the floor, and apologies for mispronouncing your name if that has happened.
Thank you very much, and no problem with my difficult name. So good to see so many of you, and special welcome. Happy to see that so many from civil society are joining us today. It's a pleasure to talk with you in this webinar, and thank you for inviting me to speak. Also, I would like to thank our hosts, the Danish Institute for Human Rights, for convening this webinar, and not least, thank you for developing the monitoring tool that will be presented. On the 25th anniversary of its adoption, the UN Declaration on Human Rights Defenders is widely recognized, but unfortunately not sufficiently implemented. The declaration was a milestone back in 1998. It was adopted by consensus following more than 13 years of negotiations in the UN Human Rights Commission. It defined for the first time the right to defend human rights. It also acknowledged the risks following from the activities of human rights defenders and recognized the need for them to be protected. Through its adoption, UN member states also recognized the role and contributions of human rights defenders and their needs for protection. Human rights defenders have had an unquestionable impact on the communities and countries since the adoption of the declaration, as well as before the declaration was adopted. They should be credited with many of the important advances that have been made in the field of human rights in this time. The most recent report of the UN Special Rapporteur on the situation of human rights defenders, Ms. Mary Lawler, includes many telling examples of this work, and I look forward indeed to hear her keynote speak later. Unfortunately, for some time, we have seen the values and norms underpinning our societies being put under pressure. And this happens, as you also mentioned in your introduction, all over the world. Human rights defenders defend all our rights, not least the rights of vulnerable communities and victims of human rights violations and abuses. As those who stand in the front line, they are often the first to suffer the consequences when democratic norms, rule of law, and human rights are set aside. They work with high personal risk, which they have a right to be protected from. Too many continue to be killed, imprisoned, threatened, or harassed for peacefully promoting and defending human rights. Norway has for several years introduced and facilitated agreement on resolutions in the Human Rights Council and the General Assembly, calling for stronger measures to implement this declaration. We have succeeded in gaining understanding and mutual agreement about this need among all the UN member states. However, the gap remains between what UN member states have agreed to and the reality experienced by human rights defenders on the ground in many parts of the world. National human rights institutions continue to be valuable partners for human rights defenders through their engagement with them, monitoring the legislation and making recommendations to authorities. That's why we welcome the development of this tool. We hope it will further contribute towards showing where there are shortcomings in the framework within which human rights defenders work. This way, it can uncover what measures to take to further improve the environment. We hope the tool will be in demand by several NHRIs and others. Gaining more insight on how to strengthen national monitoring and implementation of the declaration is key to create and maintain the safe and enabling environment that human rights defenders need and deserve. I look forward to the discussion this afternoon and the many contributions, and especially from the Special Rapporteur and the members of the panel. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Mrs. Alsoka, for this very good opening and for highlighting as well that, the objective of having such a tool is really to help identify the shortcomings in the frameworks, because that is definitely what can help with the way forward. Thank you so much for opening up this conversation. I will now invite Mr. Francesco Motta to take the floor. Francesco is the Chief of the Asia Pacific, Middle East and Northern Africa branch of the Fields Operation and Technical Cooperation Division from the Office of the High Commissioner for Human Rights. Francesco, thank you so much for being here with us. You have the floor.
Thank you so much, and it's a pleasure to be here with you, actually. And I'm really sorry for my long title, the job title, right? It's always a showstopper, that one. But listen, I just really wanted to say how pleased I am to be here with you all to discuss something so important as this tool that's been launched. For many years, the right to protect human rights was a sort of an unstated right? It wasn't sort of embodied in any documentation, etc. And so in many ways, it's an overlooked right, but it's an essential and fundamental and critical right, because without the right to go and claim rights or to protect rights or to defend rights, many of our human rights will become obsolete or nugatory, or they will not be respected and protected. And so the role that human rights defenders play in assuring the rights for all of us are absolutely essential and fundamental. But unfortunately, I mean, and this leads me to the 3 points I just wanted to raise, hopefully very briefly. The first point, of course, is, and very sadly, is that human rights defenders, journalists and trade unionists continue to be the subject of attacks in various countries around the world. And the situation has not got any better over recent years. In fact, in many ways, it has deteriorated. According to the United Nations data, between 2015 and 2021, 1/3 of all UN member states had instances where human rights defenders were attacked, targeted, or subject to abuse, or sometimes were even killed or disappeared. And COVID, of course, didn't make the situation any better. In fact, COVID in many ways permitted member states to put themselves back into the center of control in an already deteriorating environment for civil society in many countries. And as the vaccines started to be rolled out across many countries, there are over 300 deadly attacks against human rights defenders, journalists and trade unionists in 35 countries, and at least 9 cases of enforced disappearance during 2021 alone. And of course, the situation did not improve in 2022. In fact, the figures exceeded those of 2021 in terms of the attacks on human rights defenders, etc., often driven by ongoing conflicts, hostility towards human rights defenders from many quarters of society. And of course, OHCHR will, as the custodian of SDG Indicator 16.10.1, will be providing updated figures in relation to the situation of human rights defenders in our 2023 SDG reports. This brings me to the second point, and that's the essential role that national human rights institutions can play in promoting and protecting the rights of human rights defenders. These institutions are mandated to promote and protect human rights for all, and if they're implementing their mandates, they're able to leverage their mandates to ensure a safe and enabling environment for human rights defenders. So when human rights institutions are operating in compliance with the Paris Principles, they can really help states fast-track vital protection and other services to left-behind groups. By virtue of this mandate, NHRIs and their staff members are themselves human rights defenders, and sadly, this means that many of those working for NHRIs themselves have come under violent or subject to violent attacks and harassment. We could recall that in the years prior, for example, to the dissolution of the Independent Human Rights Commission in Afghanistan, that a number of their staff members, human rights educators, investigators and project managers, were killed. And of course, in the Philippines some years ago, the NHRI's leadership there was subject of hate speech, what we called red tagging and incitement to violence, but even by top political figures. Yet they and many other NHRIs continue to stand up for human rights with an unwavering commitment to their duty. So it's in such a climate that the Global Alliance of the National Human Rights Institutions, or GANRI, adopted the Marrakesh Declaration, which included a commitment to strengthen civic space monitoring, including the critical roles of NHRIs within this monitoring mechanism, and to do so within the lines of the methodological and data frameworks of the SDG Indicator 16.10.1. But with 7 years left of the SDG agenda, the 2030 agenda, I think that many states are finding themselves at a very decisive moment, and that if they don't act quickly or decisively enough in terms of establishing or supporting strong independent NHRIs, civic space and its actors, including human rights defenders, will continue to suffer the consequences of a shrinking space. This brings me to the third and final point, and that is that human rights, the OHCHR staunchly supports initiatives to buttress the role of NHRIs in monitoring civic space. And there's a number of key roles and actions that NHRIs can take in relation to this. We need an all hands on deck approach. We need NHRIs deserve our full support in this fight. And we need good and handy tools such as the right to defend human rights defenders framework, which I think is going to be critical in the coming years and will be a great tool to assist NHRIs and others in this critical work. In the past 2 years, OHCHR has collaborated with the Danish Institute of Human Rights and the Expert Reference Group, primarily to develop a framework of indicators to assess the implementation of the UN Declaration on Human Rights Defenders. And at its core, SDG Indicator 16.10.1 on killings and other attacks against HRDs, journalists and trade unionists. And this framework will help NHRIs present a holistic snapshot of this environment. Equally important, the tool can potentially serve as a platform for systematic cooperation between NHRIs, civil society organisations and national statistical offices. In Kenya and the Philippines, OHCHR has been working with NHRIs, national statistic officers and CSOs, civil society organisations, to establish national implementation mechanisms for SDG Indicator 16.10.1. And NHRIs serve as the custodian of this indicator, and as such, they're able to integrate data on attacks against HRDs coming from government institutions and CSOs in terms of the information that's being gathered. Data integrated and validated by the NHRI are then provided to the NSOs, the National Statistical Officers, for national SDG reporting, and also to OHCHR for global reporting. So just in closing, we hope that the implementation of the Right to Defend Rights tool and the SDG Indicator 16.10.1 will proceed in a synergistic and complementary manner, because we believe that together they're the best tools available for states, NHRIs, national statistical officers and civil society partners for tracking progress on states' commitments to preserving the open civic space where fundamental freedoms are freely and safely exercised by everyone. So my gratitude to all of you for organising this seminar, and of course for this tool. I think it's as I said, it's very timely, and I wish you all the best for the discussions today. Thank you very much. Over to you.
Thank you very much, Francisco, for highlighting the role of NHRIs in all of this as well. This will be a nice segue to some of the conversations we'll have later on with the NHRIs who have been participating in the data collection using this tool, and with support also from the OHCHR. In fact, your office has been a very key partner in the development of the monitoring framework and in providing important inputs and guidance along the way. And we thank you very much for that. Not least also for highlighting the role of NHRIs in this whole data universe, which is still a preliminary in a way, preliminary, I would say, in acknowledgement, but not in practice work out there. So we're very excited to have this tool as one avenue for highlighting even more the role that NHRIs can play, both, as you mentioned, in combating the shrinking of civic space, but also in the monitoring and the data collection process for that as well. Thank you so much for that. And thank you to the both speakers who have participated in this opening and given the opening remarks. I have now the pleasure to invite our keynote speaker, Mrs. Mary Lawler, the UN Special Rapporteur on the situation of human rights defenders. And Mary, congratulations on the recent renewal of your mandate at the Human Rights Council for 3 more years on this position. This is certainly an important testimony to the significant work that you have been doing to promote and protect human rights defenders. And Mary, before I give the floor to you, could you please share what you have identified in the past 3 years as some of the global trends in terms of violations against human rights defenders and the restrictions to their enabling environment? And also, what are some of the priorities for the next year to counter the deterioration of this environment? Mary, you have the floor.
Thank you very much for having me here today. And let me say how delighted I am to join you and to launch the Right to Defend Rights monitoring tool. And my sincere thanks and congratulations to the Danish Institute for Human Rights and all the other partners involved. I have been working in this field for a very long time, and one thing we do know for certain is that violations against human rights defenders are hugely underreported. Since taking up my mandate, I have also witnessed a regional imbalance in terms of where complaints to the mandate come from, with more coming from human rights defenders in Asia and the Americas, for example, than from defenders in the other regions. So I do hope that in systematizing a method for data collection, this will eventually lead to better reporting in all parts of the world. I am particularly pleased to see the NHRIs represented here today, and there's a few I'd like to talk to afterwards, as they will be very crucial in ensuring the success of this tool. I know that they too can sometimes be working in very challenging conditions. On the specific question of trends, I sometimes get asked if I agree with the consensus that the world is becoming worse and worse place for human rights defenders. In short, I don't really, because in the 40+ years that I've been doing this work, I have seen waves of improvements and disimprovements for those who stand up for the rights of others. I think back to the 70s and the awful dictatorships who were in Latin America, where human rights defenders were being dropped out of planes and murdered in their thousands in football stadiums. I think of Idi Amin in Uganda, the tyrants in power in Equatorial Guinea and Central African Republic, and the apartheid regime in South Africa, and the horrendous violations being carried out in the USSR and China during the Cultural Revolution. So compared with that time, we have undoubtedly seen improvements, and we are undoubtedly in a better place for the defense of human rights now. Women human rights defenders are freer now, than they were in the 70s, 80s, and 90s, while the LGBTIQ community, though still under siege in many places around the world, have made great strides in recent decades. That said, it is clear, and everybody I've heard so far has acknowledged this, that the political environment has become more repressive in the last 20 years, following what seemed to be a hopeful period in the 90s, with the breakup of the Soviet Union, the ending of apartheid, democratic waves in Latin America and sub-Saharan Africa, and of course, agreement on the Declaration on Human Rights Defenders in 1998, 25 years ago. But despite this, I think the progress made by the human rights movement in that time has been significant. I don't think it's an overestimation to say that there are more human rights defenders working in more countries than ever before. I recently looked up some statistics which were staggering. They are better networked than at any time in history, and they are making progress at the international level despite stiff opposition frequently. My report to the Human Rights Council that I presented last month was full of examples of small victories, like the release of individual human rights defenders, or large systemic changes, such as overturning unjust laws, all brought about through the persistent, dedicated, committed work of human rights defenders. Indeed, the successes of the women human rights defender movement and LGBT movement over the past 25 years comes out very strongly in terms of what gains they have achieved. With the above in mind, there are 3 trends I'd like to highlight, which I see continuing today, and although not new, they do have a very detrimental impact on the safety and security of human rights defenders. The first one is human rights defenders continue to be killed in large numbers. My first thematic report to the Human Rights Council was on this topic, because it is an absolute shocking scandal that it has been allowed to continue for so long, and it should be a red line for governments. The hundreds that are recorded killed every year are just the ones we hear about, and tend to be located mostly in Latin America and Asia, and working on the environment and indigenous rights. But I'm sure that there are dozens more being killed in Africa and the Middle East that we.
Oh no, it seems we lost Mary in the connection in the middle of such a powerful speech.
Can you?
Mary, yes.
I don't know what
Yes.
happened there. Anyway,
I'm sorry for that.
I was saying that I'm sure, you know, that dozens more defenders are being killed in Africa and the Middle East than we're just not hearing about. And again, I hope that this tool may be used to aid data collection. For example, earlier this month, Frontline Defenders released a report highlighting that over 400 defenders were recorded killed last year. Everybody here is aware of the restrictive legislation that is being used to silence human rights defenders and target their organizations. Dozens of states in every region of the world have introduced such legislation in the last 25 years. In the 3 years that I have been doing the job, I've raised the cases of dozens of human rights defenders sentenced under national security or counter-terrorism legislation charges. In my report, my 2021 report to the General Assembly, I highlighted the cases of 148 human rights defenders in 24 countries who had been sentenced to imprisonment or were at risk of long imprisonment of over 10 years or more. Some of those people had been in prison for over 20 years, and one man had been in prison for 33 years. Of these already sentenced, 93% had been charged with terrorist or national security crimes. And it's such an easy way for governments to put away people. And these types of charges allow states to keep human rights defenders in prison for longer and subsequently mistreat them in prison for longer. Long-term imprisonment is an ongoing and really an issue I feel very strongly about because it is just so abysmally cruel. Thirdly, I'm concerned by the hostility women human rights defenders face online and offline. We've seen the moves to roll back women's rights accelerate in a number of countries. Over the past few years, with bans targeting reproductive rights in the USA, the decriminalization of domestic violence in Russia, to the withdrawal of Turkey from the Istanbul Convention and the abolition of women's education in Afghanistan. The fight for women's rights is entering a new phase, and women human rights defenders are at the forefront of this, leading from the streets in Iran, in Sudan, in Myanmar, and doing crucial monitoring and documenting work in Yemen, in Ukraine, and elsewhere. Again, though, it is important to highlight that for many reasons, the mandate does not receive as many complaints about violations against women human rights defenders as it does for men who are human rights defenders. This is another data gap that I hope the tool can go some way towards addressing. Though I do know, obviously, that it is not only a lack of information that results in this gap. And I'll finish by highlighting some of the priorities for my second term. At the core of my mandate, you know, remote human rights defenders who are unconnected regionally, internationally, or even locally continue. I will continue to try and reach them. And I am focusing this year on youth and children who are human rights defenders who are at risk. And we plan a conference in Vienna on the 5th of June for children and youth human rights defenders, because they're going to be the ones that will carry the declaration into the future for the next 25 years. And they need to be included in mainstream human rights defender debates. Their voices need to be heard, and they certainly have been neglected. Secondly, I'm going to maintain my focus on human rights defenders, as I said, sentenced to over 10 years or more, because they just fade away. They get lost when they fade from the site and nobody takes them up anymore. And I think we all need to make sure that we continue to work on their cases. And given the numbers of killings of human rights defenders, that will also continue to be a big priority for me, and particularly in the context of business and human rights, because we know that more defenders are killed in this context on land, environmental and indigenous. My next report to the General Assembly in October will be Women Human Rights Defenders, Peace and Security. And my office is sending out the call for inputs for this report this week. And I hope that some of you present here will consider submitting information. Additionally, in the second term, I want to continue to work on reprisals against human rights defenders who have disabilities, and also the work that we started on LGBTI defenders. So thank you very much for having me, and I look forward to collaborating with you in this work in the next 3 years, and really hope that this tool will make the work much more efficient. Thank you very much, and I look forward to the discussion.
Thank you very much to you, Mary, for highlighting so many important points that would be hard to cover, but for reminding us of the historical trajectory of how the enabling environment moves also with history and where we are right now, also for giving some positive outlook towards the future and where we are right now in comparison to the past, but also not forgetting to mentioning the very hard situation that we still face nowadays. Also for talking about data, and it has been one of the challenges in the tool, and it will continue to be, we believe, a living tool as well to improve on the data disaggregation, for example, on the aspects that is specific to, as you mentioned very well, women or children and so on. So we hope to continue developing this work also in partnership with those who are working on those issues in the future. But thank you so much again. Before I continue, I have to consider myself guilty for speaking too fast. So I will slow down as well. And this is a reminder to all the speakers that are coming after me for the interpretation. It can be really hard if we get too excited in the way that we speak and go too fast. So please, a reminder to all future speakers and to myself as the first guilty one here. But now we are ready to move to the next segment. And in this part, we wish to explore two things. First, the role of national human rights institutions in the promotion and protection of human rights defenders. And this we will hear from nothing less than the Global Alliance of National Human Rights Institutions. And second, we will hear from OHCHR about the opportunities and the challenges of collecting data on human rights violations against human rights defenders and the restrictions in their enabling environment. And we will start with GUNRI, which is the Global Alliance of National Human Rights Institutions. And Mrs. Catherine Rose is the representative of the Geneva Secretariat. She has kindly sent us her inputs in a video as she could not be here live with us today. So Katerina will speak in her video about the role of national human rights institutions in the protection and promotion of human rights defenders and the commitments that these institutions have made to use their mandates in this area. So now to the video.
It's a pleasure joining you today for this very important event. And I wanted to start by thanking the Danish Institute for Human Rights, the UN Human Rights Office, and all partners and all those who contributed to the development of the Rights to Defend Rights monitoring tool. 2023 marks the 25th anniversary of the Declaration on Human Rights Defenders. And this year we also celebrate the 75th anniversary of the Universal Declaration for Human Rights and the 30th anniversary of the UN Paris Principles. Human rights defenders play a vital role in promoting and protecting human rights of all, in monitoring human rights situations, advocating for change and holding those responsible for human rights violations to account. And in today's challenging times, this role and these contributions are ever more important. At the same time, however, human rights defenders face significant challenges and risks. This includes, for example, threats and attacks, harassment and intimidation. It can also include restrictive laws which impede the work of human rights defenders and restrict fundamental freedoms and civic space. As both protectors of human rights defenders and human rights defenders themselves, national human rights institutions are also concerned by these worrying trends. And GANVI, in fact, receives increasing reports from all regions about national human rights institutions, their members and staff, which are subject to threats, attacks, harassment, or other acts of intimidation as a result of the work that they carry out. So in this context, it is absolutely essential for us to strengthen and focus on the way that we monitor and report on civic space and on the situation of human rights defenders, also in line with SDG 16.10.1. The collection and analysis of data, which is disaggregated, including on the basis of gender, is absolutely critical if we want to better understand the situation of human rights defenders, the challenges that they face, if we want to better support them in their work, but also hold those responsible for violations to account. States as duty bearers under international law are primarily responsible for the collection of data, and so it's important for us to continue to call on states to collect disaggregated data, and in doing so to cooperate with national human rights institutions and with other human rights defenders and partners. NHRIs play a vital role in promoting and safeguarding civic space and in promoting the vital role of human rights defenders in line with their mandate and functions under the UN Paris Principles. And back in 2018 in Marrakesh at the 13th International Conference of GANVI, NHRIs from around the globe came together and adopted the Marrakesh Declaration, which provides a blueprint for their work in protecting civic space and the important work of human rights defenders. And so in order to fulfill these commitments, GANVI launched a global action plan on human rights defenders and civic space, which supports NHRIs and builds their capacities in relation to civic space and human rights defenders. It includes supporting the development of monitoring tools for national human rights institutions that allow the collection and disaggregation of data. It has a gender-based and women human rights defenders focus, and also supports national human rights institutions in their reporting of such data and information on national human rights situations to UN human rights mechanisms. And so it's against this backdrop that we very much welcome today's event and the monitoring tools launch. And we are assured that the monitoring tool will serve as a very important tool for the work of national human rights institutions in monitoring and reporting on civic space and the situation of human rights defenders, and also in supporting the development of policies and programs that support the work of defenders, and ultimately in holding those responsible for account. So thank you once again for the cooperation and this initiative, and I wish you a very successful event. Thank you.
Yes, we thank Katarina for the effort of sending this message and also for the commitment that GANVI has with the subject and with supporting national human rights institutions in being able to utilize their mandate to protect the civic space as well. Now, I would like to turn to Mr. Mark Sebreros, the Human Rights Officer in the Indicator and Data section of the OHCHR, and in fact, a close partner in this work. Hello, Mark. Mark, we would like to hear your reflections on a few things from OHCHR's perspective. What is the availability of country data on violations against human rights defenders at the moment? And can national human rights institutions play a role in data collection? Can you touch also upon the potential and weaknesses of the SDG indicator 16.10.1 to capture the violations and restrictions facing human rights defenders? Thank you, Mark. You have the floor.
Thank you. Thank you, Sayonara. Good morning, good afternoon, good evening to everyone who's in this call. and it's a great privilege to be part of this launch event of the Right to Defend Rights tool, and to be part of the work that went to the development of this tool over the past 2 years. I'd like also to acknowledge the role of my colleague Batar Baray Magnay from the Civic Space Unit of OHCHR, and also the other colleagues who have contributed inputs from the side of OHCHR to this tool. On your first question about the availability of data, so this SDG indicator, if I may just refresh the minds of our colleagues in this call, is one of the SDG indicators agreed upon by member states back in 2015 to measure progress under the 2030 Agenda for Sustainable Development. So in itself, that was a big step because states were saying part of our development commitments is to make sure that it is safe for human rights defenders to defend the rights of others. And we're aiming for 0 attacks, especially 0 killings whenever somebody defends the rights of another person. So it was a big, it remains to be a big political commitment, and it's underpinned, of course, by the state's human rights obligations, including the UN Declaration on the rights of human rights defenders, among a plethora of instruments underpinning the state's commitments to fundamental freedoms. So I'm raising this because first and foremost, it's the obligation of states to make sure that no killings, no attacks are happening. And then as part of the transparency commitment and accountability to the 2030 Agenda and to human rights, they need to make sure that the data is available in relation to their fulfillment of that obligation and the fulfillment of other actors as well. And as seen in the past years, member states, in other words, governments, have been very hesitant, to use the term mildly, to release their own data. And we all know why. There are various challenges that they face, but also there's a lack of commitment. We have to admit on their part to release this. But of course, there are a few countries that have been releasing or citing data, maybe less than 5 countries who in the past 6 VNR cycles have indicated that this is the data on attacks against human rights defenders in their countries. So that's on the part of countries. What is the role of OHCHR? Our role as custodian is to develop a data collection and methodological framework that states would then approve. And NSO's statistical offices in particular would be in charge of implementing this methodological framework in partnership with NHRIs. So when we were developing the methodology for SDG Indicator 16.10.1, the role of NHRIs was front and center, because there's no other institution at the country level, a state institution, that would be able to do this credibly and in line with their constitutional and legal mandates, and in close coordination with the Office of the Commissioner for Human Rights than NHRIs. And we're happy to see NHRIs stepping up, and in 2019, the Marrakesh Declaration came out saying that NHRIs are committed to improve civic space monitoring in line with 16.10.1. But that being said, for the past SDG progress reports in the past 5 years, OHCHR has been playing the role of integrator of data from all possible sources. So the human rights mechanisms, including the special rapporteurs reporting, the work of treaty bodies, the work of OHCHR as the principal human rights agency, also contribution from important partners like Frontline Defenders, Business and Human Rights Resource Center, Global Witness, all the available information that we have, we try to integrate them and release in various reports, including to the SDG report of the Secretary General, and the report that Mary cited 2 years ago, 2020, on killings of human rights defenders. So in terms of data availability, we have around 90 countries where we have global data available on killings and enforced disappearances. And as Mary highlighted, that is actually an underrepresented figure. There's a bias in favor of countries where there's a vibrant civil society and people have access to information about these events. There's also a geographic, let's say, black hole, because some countries where the worst violations are occurring also don't have a vibrant civil society, and many of these attacks happen underground or are not publicized. So the question is, how do we make sure that these events get reported, recorded, and validated? And so does hence the important role of NHRIs, who are on the ground, who are working day in and day out with civil society partners to improve data collection. But let me now go on to the second point, which is the limitation of the indicator. As I said earlier, there's a statistical bias in favor of reporting. What gets reported gets included. What doesn't get reported are left out. So how do we address that? So we need to intensify partnerships between certain partnerships between NHRIs and civil society and OHCHR and other actors. So this whole of nation, this multi-stakeholder approach is quite important to address this gap and to make sure that the methodology is applied consistently by all institutions involved. And I hope our colleagues from the NHRIs of the Philippines and Kenya would be able to speak to this kind of multi-stakeholder partnership. And more important, and in addition to this tool that we are launching today, which puts which identifies complementary indicators that look into the structural and programmatic issues that underpin the phenomenon of attacks against human rights defenders, is quite important, because then we understand better why are attacks persisting in this particular context. Is it because of difficulties in terms of legal framework? Is it because of attitudes? Is it because of programmatic issues? So the tool in itself, which will give us this kind of holistic data set that would allow for a more comprehensive and deeper analysis of the situation. So I think it's very timely, and we're very happy to be part of this group moving forward. Thank you, Sainara, and apologies for running over time.
Thank you, Mark. And that was my polite way of trying to control the time by raising my hand. And thank you for observing that. And we thank you again. I mean, the Office of the High Commissioner Methodology for Development of Human Rights Indicators has been the basis, the backbone of this tool. And we are grateful for having had the privilege of collaborating with you throughout this period. And we do hope, as you mentioned, that this can also help trigger more collaborative monitoring efforts at countries to bring those underreported data up to the surface again. Thank you, Mark. I will now move on to my colleague, Carol Rusk, who is the Chief Advisor at the Danish Institute for Human Rights. And Carol is also the soul of this project. Carol, I'm looking at her here across the room. The Institute has developed this framework together with a number of institutions in what we called the expert reference group. And this, they could guide us through, if you can guide us through the framework, reflecting on the methodology that was used, the areas that have been covered, and also if you can show us how this work have then come to life in the online platform. Thank you, Carol, you have the floor.
Thank you very much, Sainara. And just to correct, there are two souls in behind this tool at the Institute, and Sainara is certainly one of them. And just also thanks a lot again, Sainara said it, to all the institutions, NHRI networks, NHRIs and civil society organizations that have invested a lot of time with us over the last 2 years. We really, really appreciate it. So very quickly, because I know my time is short and I have a very strict chair here. So the Right to Defend Rights is an online assessment tool to systematically monitor progress in a particular national context on the enabling environment for human rights defenders. It takes as its outset the United Nations Declaration on Human Rights Defenders, as this is the comprehensive framework, we've heard it today from many speakers, that we have, which outlines the key rights and fundamental freedoms needed for defenders to work in a safe and enabling environment. And the tool operationalizes the monitoring of these rights and freedoms through human rights indicators, as many have alluded to before, which we have developed in consultation with our good colleagues in the Office of the High Commissioner using their human rights indicator methodology. So it has covered both structural indicators, which are looking at some of the policy and legislative issues. It looks at indicators that measure the efforts of states to implement these commitments. So looking at things like the effectiveness of protection mechanisms, but also, for example, the percentage of police officers trained in policing assemblies and other issues that would actually be able to measure the level of effort states are making. And then we, of course, have indicators that actually look at, well, are defenders enjoying these rights or not? So it is meant, and I think many people have spoken about this before, so I'm not going to spend too much time on this, just to say it is meant to be a tool for cooperation and I'm to speak a bit slower. It is meant to be a tool for cooperation and collaboration, particularly between national human rights institutions where they exist and human rights defenders and their networks. It is also meant to be, as Mark has alluded to, a comprehensive assessment or baseline. So focusing on killings and other serious cases of violations, but also looking at legislation, mechanisms and actual practices that may lie behind these violations. It is a capacity building tool, and I will show you in a little while why we hope that it will serve in this role. And it's very importantly meant to help us identify what are the gaps, and in this way help us to prioritize what are the types of issues we should be working with at the national level. So I will start by very quickly showing you some of the tool, and just checking that you can see my screen. Yes. So as you can see, this is once you have requested an account, you will access this online assessment. And as you can see, the assessment is divided into 5 categories representing the human rights and freedoms underpinning the UN Declaration. So you see there is a focus on freedom of opinion and expression, freedom of association and assembly, the right to participate in public affairs, and liberty and security of persons. So freedoms that really are important for the safe and enabling environment for defenders. If we look at one particular category, I'm now choosing, for example, the freedom to hold peaceful assemblies. It will give you a little bit of insight into how the tool is structured. So we start with, as you can see, online questions and response options. Behind all of these questions, we have guidance here that explains a bit why we've chosen this question and how we collect data on this. It also provides examples of where at the national level you might be able to find information to respond to this question. And we also make links to those institutions that may already be collecting data, so national actors can have a look at these. We make a point of linking to the international standards. And particularly here, as you can see, we link to the UN Declaration. So here we can see the link between the Declaration and peaceful assembly. But we make a particular effort to underline that these articles in the Declaration are also backed by legally binding treaty obligations, where we, as you can see here, we link to the ICCP Article 21, a treaty body, a provision in a UN treaty, but also we give, as you can see here, related UN general comments that would help the respondent to assess the legislation. We also provide in the tool, if I just close a few of these, so we also provide in the tool examples of concepts that we use so that we eliminate any subjectivity in the responses. So for example, here we draw on the UN General Comment 37 on how we are supposed to understand peaceful assembly. So in this way, we hope that the tool can provide a capacity building role. With all the responses, we request specific data sources so that the responses, if questioned, can be also checked. Then very quickly, if I turn to another category, just to give you insight into freedom of expression. So what I want to highlight here is a tool builds on different both qualitative and quantitative data. So we have questions such as the one here around the legislation on freedom of expression, which requires an expert assessment, so a legal analysis of the provisions in the national implementing legislation and how it relates to freedom of expression standards, human rights law. But we also, as you can see, request data that is more of an administrative data nature, either from NHRIs database or also from other institutions. But we're also, and I think we particularly highlight, we've already discussed it, particularly in Mark's presentation, we're very keen also on getting citizen-generated data, also in collaboration with NHRIs through this cooperation on the tool. So maybe just to very quickly again show you the question, if my the network is fast enough, to show you the question that is particularly related to the 1610.1 question that Mark indicator that Mark raised. So here we have a question that is particularly linked to the 1610.1 indicator, and we have worked with Mark and will continue to work with Office of the High Commissioner to make sure that that the methodology is also as it develops is also in keeping if new guidelines come up. But we have used the metadata from the 1610.1 indicator to develop this question. So we have both the harmful acts, but as you can see, we have also disaggregation by gender, by age, by other provided characteristics, and by the alleged perpetrators of acts and issues worked on. So I think, and just maybe I'll just end with a final note about the validation of data, because this, of course, is a very important point for us as well. So the tool at the moment, we encourage validation through two ways, and most of them at the national level. So when a respondent has entered their data, we ask them to ensure that there is an internal quality control, and no data is published until that internal quality control has been established. And also we highly recommend an external quality review by an independent external actor or actors, so that we are sure that any data that is eventually published is also verified and validated. So I think I will stop for here and just say that we hope that this framework will be used as we have developed it for, and to support cooperation between national actors, but not least to generate more national action. So thank you, and over to you, Sayonara.
Thank you very much, Carol, for showing the tool. I think that's also one of the highlights of this event, of actually seeing how this work has been translated into what we try to do in a modern, facilitated way for those working with data, to get out of an Excel sheet and actually work with something that is interactive, that is also embedded with guidance, with standards that can help or can facilitate also the use of the data for different purposes, both for the monitoring, but also for the reporting of the issues that are related to each of the questions in the questionnaires of the data collection, for example, human rights reporting, or for reporting on the SDGs as well. But I will stop here, because now also one of the highlights of this event is coming with the next segment, where I would like to turn to my colleagues from NHRIs, National Human Rights Institutions, from Georgia, Kenya, and the Philippines, who are here with us today, and who have piloted and collected data using this tool. So now we come to the concrete part of, is this working at all? So this will be an interactive panel discussion. So I again ask my fellow speakers here to keep the answers short, so that we can have a little bit more of interaction. My colleagues here in Copenhagen will also be taking a look at the chat and see if there are questions that should be brought up in this conversation as well. But for now, I would like to invite to our virtual panel. The first speaker is Samson Omodi from the Kenya National Commission on Human Rights. Then we will also have Tinatin Tinikasvili from the Public Defender Ombudsman Office of Georgia, and Raymond Corsuelo from the Commission on Human Rights of the Philippines. Thank you all for joining us here. We perhaps start with Kenya, and I would ask now would be a good time for the three of you to have your cameras on, and so that we can have more of this interaction right now. So if I can start with Samson, and so good to see you on the screen there, Samson. It would be interesting to hear about, how has it been, because you are still on ongoing process of collecting the data there, the process for collecting the data. Are you working with other actors? How is this process going on for you in Kenya?
Thank you, Sayonara. Thank you, Caro, and thank you, other colleagues. Good morning, good evening, good afternoon, wherever you are. My name is Samson Omodi, and I serve at the NHRI in the country. I think I will get straight to your where it has been. Let me just make 2 comments. Number one is that I love the comment that has been made by the Special Rapporteur, that it is important to stand for the rights of others, because those who stand for the rights of others, their rights are never protected. And I think that is the space that the Kenya National Commission on Human Rights has come to step into, and really rally for human rights. Whenever they have challenges, their rights are promoted and protected. Now, what has been the process like? I think the first point to note is that data exists out there by several human rights defenders that collect this data in several ways, using several means and methods. But I think one of the challenges that is faced out there is that this data is not brought together through either a coherent way, or in a way in which it can be accessed and in which it can be used for either programming and using it in protecting and promoting not just the rights of human rights defenders, but also the rights of the general public, who are the main recipients of this. And therefore, at the Commission, what we did is to identify the potential data sources across all the actors that we work with, looking at the tool that has just been prepared, that has just been prepared by Carol, is that we went ahead and identified all these actors that are in a position to provide to share the provided data. And this spread across individual human rights defenders, institutional human rights defenders, state institutions, the youth, and defenders that are working on different sectors. So that was the first step. Take them to a capacity building workshop, just so that they can know what is it that is required from them when collecting this data. And that was a rigorous process that took us 3 days in just going through the tool that is required, how this data would be shared, and then how the commission will use it for reporting. Then the third process was now to get to the individual institution and collect this data, so that we develop a mechanism through which this data comes to the commission. And now the final process has now been inputting this data into the tool. And therefore, the bottom line is the data exists out there, but it's important that all the actors that have the data are brought on board, so that in the context of leaving no one behind, we bring all the partners together to harvest that data out there. Thank you.
Thank you, Samson. And you talk about one of the points that it's really in the core of what has been mentioned here, of the objectives of this tool. We know that the situation of underreporting is also, in some cases, in some countries, related to the fact that some data is recognized and some data is not. And in some countries, there is still a lot of work to do in being able to validate data, to be able to bring to the official monitoring processes, both at national, but also at the global level. So having the opportunity to do a collaborative process where the actors come together and goes through, difficult conversations as well on even what data will count for this, who is a human rights defender in which context, and so on, and clearing up that in a collective process to bring this data in is fundamental for getting more data availability on these issues. So thank you, Samson, for that. I will pass now to Tinatin. Tinatin, it would be really interesting to hear from you on what have been the overall findings through the data collection process that you have gone through in Georgia. And through that process, did you become aware of any important gaps that your NHRI had not been addressing, but should be doing it? Did the data, in other words, reinforce or contradict the perception that your institution had on the enabling environment for human rights defenders in Georgia?
Thank you, Sayonara. So the Public Defender's Office of Georgia started to supervise the situation of human rights defenders in 2018. And since then, we have been evaluating the most prevalent trends that negatively affect this cohort or their activities from year to year. So we have also prepared a guide that comprises standards governing the rights to protect human rights. However, we didn't have a chance to analyze if the whole existing legislation and practices, whether they are problematic in the daily life or not, correspond to international safeguards of the right to protect human rights. On the other hand, the monitoring tool covers all the areas of the right and gives a chance to have this thorough understanding of the progress and implementation gaps in relation to states' obligations under SDGs and other human rights instruments. So in that sense, it really serves as a wonderful opportunity to complement our work and enhance our efforts to promote an enabling environment for civil society. Carl has already explained the questionnaires content, so I will not take your time repeating it. However, I will just share our experience on how we collected all the apposite information for the purposes of this questionnaire and what drawbacks we had on the way. The questionnaire includes different types of questions. The first set of questions is related to the legal framework governing several rights and freedoms that are of utmost importance for human rights defenders to freely undertake their activities and enjoy the right to defend human rights. For example, this includes information on the state of ratification of international human rights instruments, reporting to international human rights mechanisms, also to what extent the Constitution, national Constitution, and other other laws protect freedom of expression, assembly, association, and so on. So to answer these questions, we only used our own expert assessment and general databases that are available. The second group of questions pertains to practical aspects of these normative guarantees and how they are enforced. So for instance, there you'll come across questions regarding the number of cases when the breaches of freedom of assembly or media freedom were identified. Since we assess instances of unlawful interference with the right to peaceful assembly in our annual parliamentary reports, we answered this question through data collected by the office beforehand. As for the media censorship, although we have not evaluated any case to fall into this category, we took advantage of the possibility to use the comment section that is available in the tool, where we indicated examples of misusing legislation against media outlets and their programs, their content, resulting in the excessive curtailment of their freedom of expression. This way, we wanted to give viewers an understanding of the broader context that exists outside the meticulous wording of each question. There were also questions that we could not answer with the information and knowledge that was already accumulated within our institution, and therefore we had to reach out to relevant state bodies and ask them to provide answers. For example, questions of that ilk were about statistical information on cases of harmful acts committed against human rights defenders, and this part has been the most challenging for us since corresponding statistical data is not usually available. For example, the number of crimes committed against human rights defenders is not specifically recorded by the law enforcement, and therefore we could not provide a comprehensive answer to this question because not every case of this kind comes to our office, so we might not be aware about the full scale of this problem. The same goes for the number of arbitrary detentions during assemblies, even though this is very prevalent and systemic problem that stems from the outdated administrative offenses code that we have here in Georgia, and we highlighted this in the questionnaire. No statistics are in place, therefore we could not indicate the exact number here as well. Mostly we encountered the same issue with statistics on training sessions received by officials. It is true that ministries could confirm that their staff receives regular trainings on human rights. They could not always provide information about the total percentage of such groups. Therefore, this was the biggest challenge we faced during working on the tool to give this to reflect the information about these percentages and statistical data. As for the, I will shortly touch upon the plans and how to use this tool, if it's possible, or I can stop here and give the floor to other speaker.
Yes, maybe we can come back to that question in a bit, if that's okay. And we could hear then from Raymond in the Philippines. Raymond, you have done a fantastic job there with data disaggregation in the tool. Can you share a little bit of the experience on how the Commission is working to disaggregate data at that level? What has that meant to you, and where is the work going forward from here?
Yeah, well, greetings from the Commission on Human Rights here in the Philippines. I'm Raymond, by the way. I'm from the research division of the agency. And we realized early on that the work that would be entailed by using this tool would not be just the function of my own unit, but would require the collaboration of other offices within the Commission. It just so happened that we have dedicated units for, let's say, for example, for answering some of the questions related to the legal structures that are necessary for supporting human rights defenders, international obligations. They're also being tracked by one of our sister divisions. And I also would like to emphasize the role of our regional offices. In the Philippines, we have 16 regional offices that are doing data collections across the different administrative regions in the country. They investigate cases of violations against human rights defenders, hence the level of disaggregation that we have been able to input into the tool, from classifications of the sex of the human rights defenders involved, the age, and the other types of professions that are subject to violations under the present context. So we've done that, and we're moving forward, with the assistance of OHCHR. We're also engaging with the on a parallel process, the National Statistics Office, as mentioned by Mark earlier. We're collaborating with them to coming up with the assignment of the CHR as the national data provider for this particular indicator. And hopefully that will be ushered in by a process of state recognition for the data that is coming from the CHR, that it would in turn be integrated in the Philippine statistical system.
Thank you very much, Raymond. And I'm looking at the chat here and seeing also some questions. There is one addressing the role of civil society in this, and how can civil society contribute to the data gathering for the report on the tool. And we heard a little bit from Samson, the experience that they are having in Kenya. And I would actually like to invite perhaps we failed in mentioning that in the beginning, but this tool has been piloted by several institutions, including civil society organizations as well. So we see both a potential there for civil society acting as data collectors, but also to act in collaboration with, for example, a national human rights institution. And we have here Deidre de Burka, who is from Forus International and who has collaborated with some of her members of Forus to do a data collection as well from civil society perspective. Deidre, if you are available and would have 1 or 2 minutes to just address this question on the role of civil society in this, I think it would be really timely at the moment.
Sure. Thanks, Sayonara, and hello, everybody. It's been really interesting to listen to the discussion so far. And as Sayonara said, Forus, which is a global civil society network, we have a majority of our members based in southern countries. We were very happy to be part of the expert reference group that was established by the Danish Institute of Human Rights to advise on the development of this tool. And, Forus is made up of national development platforms. We have 68 national development platforms, one per country in 68 different countries across the world. And they more and more are focusing in their policy and their advocacy work on issues of civic space and human rights. However, many of them feel that they lack the level of expertise that other, specialist CSO networks have. So they were very happy to hear that we were participating in the development of this tool. And, what we have basically included as a strategic objective now for our network, for our global network, is to increase the level of human rights expertise of our members. And being part of this process has certainly helped us to realize, a number of our members between Nepal, Colombia, Nigeria, and the Dominican Republic were all involved in working to pilot the tool at the national level. And I think most of them found it quite challenging to source the kind of data that they were looking for in terms of human rights violations and so on, but also, and not even just in terms of human rights violations, there were other issues around, the existence of national legislation and so on. And there were many different sort of data sources they found hard to access. And again, we found that, the National Human Rights Institute has access to some of these and also can advise and can help to validate the data. And I think this whole area of data collection, particularly related to violations of human rights, is something that our members feel they need more capacity building on. So I would say it's been a very useful experience. It's been a learning experience to be involved with this, but there's a huge need for capacity building of civil society at the national level. And I would say much more engagement of traditional development actors, which we would consider our members to be, and members of the human rights community. So there's a lot more peer exchange, peer learning, and so on. So we really welcomed the opportunity and would like to thank the Danish Institute again for involving us in the development of this tool.
Thank you very much, Deidre, for highlighting these important points. And of course, capacity building, I think it goes both ways. Both, it's in a way a very exploratory territory, although there are some experience out there on working or bridging the development and the human rights field, and also human rights institutions, national human rights institutions, and civil society data. This is a complex setup there. So a lot of potential and fertile grounds to work on that. I see my time is running. There are many good questions in the chat. I encourage everyone to please go to the chat and address the questions as well if you have comments to those. Before I move to our last speaker, I would just ask the three of you for a 1-minute answer, if possible at all, on what do you plan to do with the data? How does the data use look like from your institution side? I will start with Samson from Kenya. 1 minute, Samson, and I will have to interrupt, I must say.
Thank you, Sainara. I think for us, we look at the data as an important tool for use in protection and promotion of human rights. I think that's the beginning. And therefore, all the work that we are going to do moving forward, we are going to ensure that the information that is coming through this tool is infused into the work that we do. I think that is one. But number two, we are also looking at the data for use in reporting for our international reporting mechanisms, because if you look at the various indicators under the data, under the tool, there are various areas that we can pick for use in international reporting mechanisms. I think that is two. But number three, we also intend to use the data for improving on the various local processes, because there are various indicators within the tool that refers to the local mechanisms, local processes, the things that we do internally within the country. So again, we think it will be an important source of information to be used for improving the local environment for protection and promotion of human rights of defenders at the local level. So the data is a useful one for programming. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Samson, and you did it. 1 minute. Tinatin, I move over to you, please. 1 minute.
Thank you. Because the tool is very extensive, there can be, I think, several approaches to that, to how to use it in the future. First of all, as it shows gaps and challenges in the way the state undertakes its responsibilities, it can be a source for NHRIs to recommend the government to or other branches as to what steps need to be taken to ameliorate the situation in which human rights defenders have to operate. Moreover, because it shows the dynamics of progress and declines in terms of enabling a safe environment for human rights defenders, the findings of the tool can be reflected in annual parliamentary reports and can also be used while reporting to international or regional human rights organizations. For instance, it can inform NHRIs rule of law report, which includes parts regarding human rights defenders. And I think this is reporting part is the what we will be using this tool mostly. The tool can also show NHRI certain areas of the right to defend human rights that the institution does not normally work on, but is important to consider while evaluating the situation of human rights defenders. Such topics might be SLAPS, for example, that is strategic litigation against public participation, which might be new for some institutions and could entail not only starting subsequent supervision, but also the capacity building of staff members and of the organizations. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Tinatin. And I acknowledge and entire respect to the interpretation group. This very quick session of 1 minute can get us speaking very fast. I'm so sorry for that. Raymond, 1 minute, please.
Yes, I would like to thank the Danish Institute of Human Rights for inviting us to this event. You know, offhand, we think this tool will be very useful. We now have an ongoing congressional debate regarding the passage of a human rights defenders bill, and the visualization offered by this particular tool can help elucidate on the number of concerns being faced by human rights defenders. We also have in the pipeline a program under the Commission on Human Rights to do an inquiry, a public inquiry on the effects of red tagging, particularly against human rights defenders. So again, the information generated from this tool, the extensiveness, the different structural process and outcome indicators will help enlighten that discussion as well. So those two upcoming events that we would be engaging in would be very impacted by this particular tool. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Raymond. And I would like to acknowledge the presence of Gabriel Almeida from the European National Human Rights Institution Network. Gabriel would have liked to say a few words, but I think in the interest of time, I will have to apologize to Gabriel, and I will move on to our final speaker, Mr. Søren Volts, the ambassador in the Department of Humanitarian Action, Civil Society and Engagement from the Ministry of Foreign Affairs of Denmark, who will give us our closing remarks. Mr. Søren, the floor is yours.
Well, thank you very much, and I'll try to be brief, but I think this will take 5 minutes, so bear with me. It's been a pleasure to participate today, and it's an honor to be able to address you with some closing remarks. Thank you to all of you for participating today and for your daily human rights engagement and for promoting the dignity and well-being of all humans. A special thanks, of course, to the co-organizers, and a sincere thank you to the many speakers today, for the opening remarks from Hervok from Norway and Francesco from the Office of the High Commissioner, to Mary Lawlor for her motivating keynote with, I suppose, comforting indication that there are more active human rights defenders now than ever. But of course, this has to be weighed up against the gravity of the development in human rights abuses. I was also pleased to learn that the Special Rapporteur sees an opportunity for the new tool to shed light on and hopefully have a concrete effect on the development as data emerge. To Katerina Nwiju from the Global Alliance and to Mark from the Office of the High Commissioner for their input, and to the representative of the National Human Rights Institutions that we just heard in the panel, to Samson from Kenya, to Tinatin from Georgia, and to Raymond from the Philippines, for enriching us today with their views and the experiences with the tool from 3 continents. And then also to Deidre from Foros for making the important connection there is to the work of the civil society organizations. And then, of course, I'm turning to you now, Carol, Sayonara and Sophie and your colleagues at the Institute for Human Rights for bringing us the new tool that better enable monitoring of the state of affairs and the national implementation of the United Nations Declaration on Human Rights Defenders. And likewise, a warm thank you to the Institute for the practical organization of this webinar and the introduction given today to the online tool. I turn to the numbers that I have seen from Frontline Defenders 2022 report that lists 401 killed human rights defenders. Regrettably, as some of you have already mentioned, numbers are even higher than they were in 2021. And these numbers are painful. In addition, we all know, and we have heard again today, that human rights defenders are subject to many other violations due to their engagement. Threats, stigmatization, imprisonment, restricted legislation and other practices to curtail and silence their legitimate activities. Therefore, the 25th anniversary is a welcome chance to celebrate and express gratitude to all human rights defenders and their crucial work. But it also marks a point in time to stand firm and redouble our efforts in support of the human rights defenders. The human rights defenders foster hope. They show solidarity when they stand up against the abuse of power by states, corporations, rebel groups, or local power structures. When documenting, publicizing, advocating, and manifesting. Without their work, repression and abuse would be even worse and hope would diminish. I trust that the Right to Defend Rights tool will be used as an important addition in support of the defenders' work. And then allow me just to take this opportunity to highlight the possibilities that stem from the new Digital Democracy Initiative that was launched only weeks ago. It's a multi-donor initiative with Denmark and the EU as present frontrunners, and more donors are expected to join. With the borders between offline and online increasingly diminishing, there is a need to strengthen the fight for democracy and human rights online. And in the spirit of leaving no one behind, the initiative will give mainly small, local civil society organizations, activists, grassroots, and advocates the digital competences and tools to mobilize and engage, while also assisting for them to have tools and actions for online threat protection. I suggest you let your network know and to stay attentive for the sub-granting mechanism to become active by probably 2024 with the civil society organizations Civicus Global Focus, Digital Defenders Partnership, and Access Now as main partners. So I now reach the conclusion, and in celebration of the 25th anniversary, I wish you all energy and progress in your continued work for the respect of the human rights and for the implementation of the United Nations Declaration on Human Rights Defenders. Thank you all very much.
Thank you very much to you, Søren, for that. And thank you also for the commitment of Denmark, and circling back to our first speaker, Norway, as well, with civic space, with civil society organizations working on these issues as well. And I know we have passed a little bit of the time here. Please check the chat. We have posted many links that can be useful also to access the tool. We still have more than 100 people with us after 1 hour and a half. We think this speaks to the relevance of this topic, and we thank you, each one of you, for being here with us today. We thank each of our speakers for the contributions to this space. Also, those who have piloted the tool and have come today to have a little exchange on their experience with us. Thank you so much to all the participants again. And yeah, we know that monitoring is just one step in a long list of actions needed to improve and enable a safe environment for human rights defenders. And we do hope that this tool will help identify in countries the way forward and also foster collaboration among actors that are so relevant in this area. I thank you again, each one of you, for this. Yeah, we are here. You have our contacts as well if you need to contact the Danish Institute on this tool. And the work will continue forward with a steering committee, which is committed to continue the development on the work of this tool and also working with the data that will come out of it. Thank you again. And I think that's it for now.